At 11:52 on a Friday morning, one of the biggest football clubs on earth had 8 minutes left to live. Not 8 minutes of a match, 8 minutes of existence. In a bank office in Glasgow, a receiver was waiting for the clock to strike noon, and the moment it did, Celtic Football Club, 106 years old, European champions watched by millions, would cease to exist. Finished. This is the story of how a giant got that close to the grave, who put it there, and the strange little man in a flat cap that everyone told to go home. Because Celtic didn't go bust that day. It came 8 minutes away, and the man who saved it was booed for it. To understand how close it came, you have to understand what was nearly lost. Celtic weren't a small club having a bad year. Founded in the East End of Glasgow in 1888, they had become one of the most famous football institutions in the world. In 1967, they did something no British club had ever done. They won the European Cup. The whole of the team born within 30 miles of the stadium, the Lisbon Lions, immortal. Hundreds of thousands of people built their lives around this club. Their support was enormous, loyal, and passed down like a name. But by the early 1990s, something was badly wrong. The stadium was crumbling. Great rusting terraces, decades without serious investment. On the pitch, their great rivals Rangers were spending millions and winning everything, marching toward a record they could taste. And Celtic, the giant, just drifted. Falling behind, falling apart, and the reason wasn't bad luck. It was who owned the club, and the fact that they treated it like a family heirloom they would never ever let go of. For generations, Celtic had been controlled by a small group of families, the Kellys and the Whites chief among them. The same names, the directors' sons becoming directors, holding the club close for the best part of a century. And by the 90s, that grip had become a slow strangulation. They didn't have the money to modernise, and they wouldn't let anyone in who did. Every serious outside investor who came knocking was turned away, because letting money in meant letting control go, and control was the one thing these families would never surrender. Then the ground shifted beneath them. After the Hillsborough disaster in 1989, British football was ordered to tear out its standing terraces and build all-seater stadiums. For a club with a crumbling ground and no money, that was a bill that could run into the tens of millions, a bill Celtic had no way to pay. The board's answer was a fantasy. Grand announcements of a brand new super stadium out in Cambuslang that never came close to being built. Press conferences and paper dreams while the debt kept climbing. And all the while, one number was getting quietly, dangerously bigger, the amount Celtic owed to the Bank of Scotland. By the early 90s it had grown past what the club could ever hope to repay. The bank was no longer a partner. It was a creditor with its patience running out. And the supporters had finally had enough. What happened next is one of the great fan uprisings in football history. A grassroots movement rose up out of the support, Celts for change, and they did something Celtic fans had never done. They turned on their own club's board, banners, demonstrations, and most powerfully of all, they stopped turning up. Organised boycotts left one of the best supported clubs in Europe playing in front of thin, echoing crowds. The message to the families was brutal and simple: go. But the board clung on, because they always had. And into this civil war walked the most unlikely rescuer you could possibly imagine. His name was Fergus McCann, a Scot who had emigrated to Canada and made a modest fortune not in oil or property or banking, but in selling golf holiday package tours across North America. He was small, softly spoken with a slight lisp, and he wore a flat cap, a bonnet, that would become the most famous hat in Scottish football. He was in every way the opposite of a glamorous saviour, and for years McCann had been trying to invest in Celtic, to save it, to modernise it. And for years the old board had rejected him again and again. At one point, by his account, more or less telling him to get out of Scotland and go back to Canada where he belonged. They were about to run out of time to say no. Quick pause. If you like these, the giants brought to the very edge, and the strange people who decide their fate, take 1 second and subscribe. This channel's still small. Every subscriber genuinely pushes it further, and there's a new story like this every week. That's it. Now back to the clock, because it's almost noon. By the spring of 1994, the end had a date on it. The Bank of Scotland had finally set its deadline. On Friday, the 4th of March, at 12 noon, if Celtic could not satisfy the bank would move and appoint a receiver. And a receiver is the end. It doesn't rescue a club. It carves it up to pay the debts. 106 years of history sold for parts. That morning the club needed £1 million immediately just to stop the fall, and the hours ticked down in a chaos of phone calls, lawyers, and last-second deals, with the clock crawling toward 12. And then, at 11:52 in the morning, 8 minutes before the deadline that would have ended Celtic Football Club forever, it was done. Fergus McCann completed his takeover. The £1 million was found, the bank was held off, and the old board was finished. Word went out to the waiting supporters in 5 words that are still quoted today: the rebels have won. McCann took a controlling 51% of Celtic for £9.5 million, and personally stood behind the club's £7 million of debt. The families who had held the club for a century were gone, and Celtic, 8 minutes from the grave, was alive. But saving a club and fixing one are two very different things, and the man who'd just rescued them was about to become the most hated figure in Glasgow. McCann was not there to be loved, he was there to build, and he was ruthless about money. Famously, painfully frugal, the very opposite of a big spending owner. He announced a strict 5-year plan, and he stuck to it with an iron will. First, he did something extraordinary. He turned the club over to its supporters. In January 1995, he launched a share issue, a chance for ordinary fans to literally own a piece of Celtic. Over 10,000 of them bought in, raising £14 million. It was the most successful share issue British football had ever seen. Then he rebuilt Celtic Park itself, not the Cambuslang fantasy, but a real stadium on the club's own ground, transformed into a 60,000-seat cathedral, the biggest club ground in the country. But here's the part that tells you everything about people. While McCann was quietly saving their club and building them the finest stadium in Britain, the supporters, many of them, turned on him. The football on the pitch wasn't winning fast enough for a fan base watching Rangers close in on a record 9, then 10 league titles in a row. McCann wouldn't gamble the club's survival on reckless spending, and so he was booed, mocked for his cap, his accent, his caution. In 1998, the very season Celtic finally won the league and stopped Rangers 10 in a row, a banner reading sack McCann was unfurled in the stands. The man who had saved them from a receiver was jeered by the people he'd saved. He never flinched. He'd made a promise, and he was going to keep it, whether they cheered him or not. In 1999, exactly as he'd promised 5 years earlier, Fergus McCann sold his shares and walked away. He'd taken control for £9.5 million. He sold out for over £40 million. He made a profit of around £30 million, and he had every right to it, because he'd bet his own money on a club 8 minutes from death when no one else would. He left behind a stadium, no debt, 10,000 fan shareholders, a youth academy, and a modern institution where there had been a corpse. The man they booed was proven right about all of it, and in the years since, the booing stopped and the truth settled in. Every Celtic supporter alive owes the existence of their club to a small, stubborn man in a flat cap who refused to be liked and refused to be wrong. Celtic is the story on this channel that didn't end in the grave, but make no mistake about how close it came. One of the biggest clubs in the world, 106 years of history, millions of hearts, all of it once 8 minutes from gone bust. If this one got to you, do 3 quick things. Hit like, it genuinely pushes this to the next person. Subscribe, because there's a new story every week. And tell me in the comments, were the fans who booed Fergus McCann wrong, or does a man like that just have to be hated to do the job? Next on Gone Bust, how a bank collapse 1,500 miles away nearly destroyed another Scottish giant. It's on your screen now. Subscribe so you don't miss how the giants fall.